His hands were already on my waist, pressing me against the cool metal of his car. The garage door was wide open, anyone could walk by, but I didn't care. His lips found mine with an urgency that made my knees weak, his body pinning me against the vehicle as his fingers traced the curve of my spine. "We shouldn't be doing this," I whispered against his mouth, even as my hands pulled him closer. He pulled back just enough to meet my eyes, his breath warm against my face. "Then tell me to stop." I couldn't. I didn't want to. Hey, if you're enjoying this wild start, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It started so innocently. I'd knocked on Owen's door that morning asking to borrow a wrench. My kitchen sink had been dripping for weeks, and I'd finally worked up the motivation to fix it myself. He'd answered in a paint-stained t-shirt and jeans, his dark hair tousled, like he'd just rolled out of bed, which, knowing Owen, he probably had. We'd been neighbors for 2 years, exchanging pleasantries over the fence, the occasional borrowed cup of sugar, but nothing more. Until today. "Wrench, huh?" He'd grinned, stepping aside to let me in. "What size you need?" I'd followed him through his house, trying not to notice how his shirt clung to his shoulders, how his voice had that rough morning quality that made something flutter in my stomach. The garage was his domain, tools organized with military precision, his motorcycle gleaming in the corner, the scent of motor oil and something distinctly masculine hanging in the air. "Honestly, I have no idea," I'd admitted, feeling suddenly foolish. "I just know there's water everywhere and my landlord won't call back." He'd laughed, a rich sound that made my skin warm. "Show me your hands." "What? Your hands? I need to see how they fit around different sizes." I'd held them out, and he'd stepped closer, so close I could smell his cologne mixed with coffee and something else, something that made my pulse quicken. His fingers had traced my palm as he explained grip, sizes, his touch lingering longer than necessary. "You've got good hands," he'd murmured, his thumb brushing across my knuckles. "Strong. Capable." The compliment had hit differently than it should have. Maybe it was the way he'd said it, or the way his eyes had darkened as he spoke, but suddenly, the air between us felt charged. Electric. "Owen?" I'd started, but he'd already moved closer, his free hand coming up to cup my cheek. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong," he'd whispered, his thumb tracing my lower lip. "Tell me you don't feel this too." I should have. I should have stepped back, made some excuse about needing to get home, grabbed the wrench and left. Instead, I'd leaned into his touch, my lips parting slightly under his thumb. "I feel it," I'd breathed. That's when he'd kissed me. Soft at first, tentative, giving me every chance to pull away. But I'd melted into him instead, my hands fisting in his shirt as he backed me against the car. The kiss deepened, became something hungrier, more desperate. His hands roamed my body with a familiarity that shouldn't have existed but felt natural, right? "God, Haley," he'd groaned against my neck, his lips trailing fire along my skin. "I've been thinking about this for months." Months? I'd gasped as he found that spot just below my ear that made my knees weak. "Since the day you moved in. Since I watched you carry all those boxes in by yourself, too stubborn to ask for help." His hands had found the hem of my shirt, fingers dancing along the skin of my waist. "You have no idea what you do to me." His confession had sent heat pooling low in my belly. All those casual conversations over the fence, all those lingering glances I'd thought I'd imagined, they'd been real. The attraction I'd tried to dismiss had been mutual. "The door," I'd managed to say, even as my body arched into his touch. "Let them look," he'd growled, but his hands had stilled. "Unless you want me to close it?" The question had hung between us, loaded with implication. Closing the door would mean commitment to whatever this was becoming. Leaving it open meant living dangerously, accepting the thrill of potential discovery. "Leave it," I'd whispered, surprising myself with my boldness. His eyes had flashed with something primal, possessive. "You sure?" Instead of answering with words, I'd pulled his head down to mine, kissing him with all the pent-up desire I'd been carrying. He'd responded immediately, his hands gripping my hips as he lifted me onto the hood of the car. The metal had been cool against my thighs through my jeans, a stark contrast to the heat of his body pressed against mine. His lips had traveled down my throat, finding the pulse point that made me gasp. My fingers had tangled in his hair, holding him against me as he worshipped my neck with his mouth. Every touch had sent electricity through my system. Every kiss had made me crave more. We should go inside. I'd managed between kisses, even as my body betrayed my words by pressing closer to his. Should we? His hands had found the button of my jeans, his fingers dancing along the waistband. Or should we stay right here where anyone could see how beautiful you look when you come apart? The raw honesty in his voice had made me shiver. There was something intoxicating about the danger, the possibility of being caught in this moment, of pure passion. The rational part of my mind had screamed warnings, but my body had already made its choice. Here, I'd breathed, my hands finding the hem of his shirt and pulling it over his head. The sight of his chest, defined from years of working with his hands, had made my mouth go dry. I'd traced the lines of his muscles with my fingertips, marveling at the way his breath hitched at my touch. He'd been beautiful in the way only a man comfortable in his own skin could be, confident without arrogance, strong without aggression. His hands had made quick work of my shirt, his eyes drinking in the sight of me in my simple black undergarments. But the way he'd looked at me, like I was something precious, something to be savored, had made me feel more beautiful than any expensive lingerie ever could. Perfect, he'd murmured, his hands skimming over my skin with reverent touches. You're perfect. When his lips had followed the path of his hands, I'd arched beneath him, my fingers gripping the edge of the car hood for support. He'd taken his time, mapping every inch of exposed skin with his mouth, making me gasp and writhe with each kiss, each gentle scrape of teeth. The sound of a car door slamming somewhere down the street had made us both freeze, suddenly aware of our exposure. But instead of pulling apart, Owen had simply shifted us, pressing my back against the side of the car that faced away from the street, shielding me from view while maintaining the delicious friction between our bodies. Better? He'd asked, his voice rough with desire. Much, I'd gasped, pulling him down for another kiss. This position had felt more intimate somehow, more connected. His body had been a solid wall of heat against mine, his hands gentle but insistent as they roamed my curves. I'd felt safe and wildly exposed at the same time, protected by his presence even as we risked everything. His fingers had found the clasp of my undergarment, pausing for permission. I'd nodded, beyond words, and he'd freed me from the confining fabric with practiced ease. The cool garage air against my heated skin had made me gasp, but his warm hands had quickly replaced the chill. So responsive, he'd murmured appreciatively, his thumbs brushing over sensitive peaks until I whimpered. I love how you react to my touch. Every caress had sent shockwaves through my system, building a tension that demanded release. My hands had found his belt, fumbling with the buckle in my eagerness. He'd helped me, his own need evident in the tremor of his fingers as we worked together to remove the barriers between us. When skin finally met skin, we'd both groaned at the contact. The feeling of his body against mine, nothing between us but heat and desire, had been overwhelming in the best possible way. He'd taken a moment to just hold me, his forehead pressed against mine as we breathed together. You okay? He'd asked softly, his concern evident even through his obvious arousal. More than okay, I'd assured him, my hands exploring the broad expanse of his back. Don't stop. He'd captured my lips in another searing kiss as his hands had mapped my body with increasing urgency. Every touch had been electric, sending sparks along my nerve endings until I'd been trembling with need. The danger of our location had only heightened every sensation, making me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. His fingers had found their way between my thighs, exploring with a confidence that had made my knees buckle. I'd clung to his shoulders as he'd worked me with skillful precision, his thumb finding that perfect spot that made stars burst behind my eyelids. Owen, I'd gasped, my body arching into his touch. That's it, he'd encouraged, his voice rough with desire. Let go for me. The tension had built impossibly high. every nerve ending singing with pleasure until I'd shattered in his arms, my cry muffled against his shoulder. He'd held me through the waves of sensation, his hands gentle and soothing as I'd come back to earth. But we hadn't been finished. The hunger in his eyes as he'd looked at me had reignited the fire in my veins. Without breaking eye contact, I'd reached between us, taking him in my hand and reveling in his sharp intake of breath. "Your turn," I'd whispered, my lips finding his throat as my hand had worked him with increasing confidence. The sounds he'd made had been intoxicating, low groans and whispered endearments that had made me feel powerful and desired. His hands had gripped my hips, his body tense with the effort of maintaining control. "Haley," he'd warned, his voice strained. "I'm not going to last if you keep doing that." "Good," I'd replied, increasing my pace until he'd groaned my name like a prayer. When he'd finally reached his peak, the sight of him losing control had been beautiful. His head had fallen back, muscles straining, a look of pure bliss crossing his features. I'd memorized every detail, filing it away as something precious and private between us. In the aftermath, we'd held each other, skin cooling in the garage. Both of us slightly stunned by the intensity of what had just happened. The rational part of my mind had started to reassert itself, pointing out all the reasons this had been a terrible idea. But with Owen's arms around me, his heart beating steadily against my chest, those concerns had seemed distant and unimportant. "Well," he'd finally said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "That wasn't exactly how I planned to spend my morning." I'd laughed, some of the tension breaking. "Your morning? I came here for a wrench." "Did you find what you were looking for?" His eyes had twinkled with mischief. "I found something better," I'd admitted, surprised by my own boldness. We'd dressed. Slowly, reluctantly, both of us aware that stepping back into our clothes meant stepping back into reality. But the charged atmosphere had remained, crackling between us like a live wire. "About that wrench," Owen had said as I'd prepared to leave, holding up the tool I'd originally come for. "Right. The sink." I'd taken it from him, our fingers brushing, in the exchange and sending another jolt of electricity through me. "If you need help with the installation, I'm pretty handy with pipes," he'd offered, his double entendre clear. "I might take you up on that," I'd replied, meeting his gaze directly. We'd stood there for a moment, neither wanting to break the spell, both knowing that crossing the threshold would mean facing the reality of what we'd done. Finally, I'd forced myself to take a step backward. "I should go," I'd said reluctantly. "Yeah," he'd agreed, but he hadn't moved to open the door wider. The walk back to my house had felt surreal. Every step had reminded me of what had just transpired, my body still humming with satisfaction and the promise of more. I'd caught myself glancing back at his garage, wondering if he was watching me go, hoping he was thinking about me the way I was thinking about him. The rest of the day had passed in a haze. I'd fixed my sink. The wrench had worked perfectly. But my mind had been elsewhere, replaying every moment, every touch, every sound Owen had made. The rational voice in my head had tried to make itself heard, pointing out the complications of getting involved with a neighbor, the potential for awkwardness if things went wrong. But every time I'd started to second-guess myself, I'd remembered the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd made me feel beautiful and desired and alive. That evening, I'd found myself lingering in my backyard, hoping to catch a glimpse of him over the fence. When I'd finally seen him working in his garden, our eyes had met and held, the memory of the morning hanging between us like a secret. He'd smiled, slow and knowing, and I'd felt that familiar flutter in my stomach. The next morning, I'd been awakened by a gentle knock at my door. When I'd opened it, Owen had been standing there with 2 cups of coffee and that same mischievous smile. "Thought you might need some caffeine," he'd said, offering me one of the cups. "Thanks," I'd replied, accepting the coffee and trying to ignore the way his fingers had lingered against mine. "How's the sink?" he'd asked, though we both knew that wasn't really what he was asking about. "Working perfectly," I'd said, "though I might have another project that needs attention." His eyes had darkened at the implication. "What kind of project?" I'd stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne again, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "The kind that might require some hands-on consultation," I'm very thorough in my consultations, he'd said, his voice dropping to that rough register that made my pulse race. I was counting on that, I'd whispered. The tension between us had been electric, ready to ignite at the slightest touch. But we'd both held back, savoring the anticipation, the delicious promise of what was to come. The morning sun had cast everything in golden light, making the moment feel dreamlike, suspended between desire and fulfillment. When? He'd asked simply. Tonight? I'd suggested, my heart pounding at my own boldness. I'll bring my tools, he'd said with a grin that made my knees weak. As he'd walked back to his house, I'd watched him go, already counting the hours until evening. The rational part of my mind had tried one more time to assert itself, pointing out all the ways this could complicate our lives. But watching Owen disappear into his house, remembering the feel of his hands on my skin, the way he'd made me feel beautiful and wanted and alive, I'd known that some complications were worth it. The truth was, what had happened in that garage had awakened something in me I hadn't even realized was sleeping. The spontaneity, the passion, the complete abandonment to the moment, it had been intoxicating. And I wanted more. Some would say getting involved with a neighbor is asking for trouble, but sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where desire overruled logic? What did you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and want to hear your stories. And if this got your pulse racing, smash that like button, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for being here and I'll see you soon.